Aseko Sawagweko, Kwe, Oki, Buju, Atilihai. I am pleased to greet you this afternoon in the languages of the Mohawk, Mi'kmaq, Blackfoot, Anishinaabe, and Inuit. These are the languages of our distinguished guests, Indigenous leaders in public speaking, academia, community outreach, and the arts. My name is Chris Hunt, and I'm a program coordinator with the YMCA of Hamilton, Burlington, Brantford, and Six Nations, and a member of the Wolastoqiyik Nation of the Wolastoq River, or St. John River in New Brunswick. We are pleased to welcome you to The Healing Journey, an Indigenous Perspectives panel on healing, resilience, and hope. Today's discussion was inspired by the story of Shirlene Bonberry, a member of the Cayuga Nation, Six Nations of the Grand River, and a survivor of the Mohawk Institute Residential School in Brantford, Ontario. In September of this year, Shirlene graciously shared her story with our YMCA employees, speaking with grace and wisdom about her own journey of healing. It is in honor of Shirlene and of all who have been impacted by Indian residential schools that we create space for this discussion. We are pleased to have Shirlene joining us on the call today. Yahweh, Shirlene. Today's event is but a small part in an ongoing series of conversations we're engaged in at our YMCA. Please stay tuned for more opportunities to listen, learn, and engage with us as we continue on this journey of truth and reconciliation. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that some of us may find what we are about to hear emotionally challenging. Should this discussion cause you distress, please know there are supports available. We have included a list of these supports in the chat, including the Hope for Wellness Helpline, which offers immediate help to all Indigenous peoples across Canada, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now I would like to hand it over to our YMCA of Hamilton, Burlington, Brantford, President and CEO, Jim Comerford, for our land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Chris. It is an honor to be able to share this land acknowledgement. And as I join this call, I'm situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, we are home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. Now, on a personal note, when I either read or listen to land acknowledgements, I reflect on what does this really mean to me? Today, when I think about the land acknowledgement just shared, I think about the Mohawk Institute Residential School, where, as we speak right now, the search for unmarked graves is underway. I think about the tragedies that took place at this location over so many decades. I also think about the very difficult healing process currently underway with many of my Six Nation friends and Indigenous people across this land, from sea to sea to sea. And I think lastly, I worry about further negative impacts and harm to the healing process that is just beginning if any unmarked graves are discovered at this residential school. Thank you for allowing me to share what I believe is a very important land acknowledgement. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Jim. And now we're going to turn it over to our YMCA Canada President and CEO, Peter Dinsdale.
Bonjour, bien Indishnakas, Wabajejen Dodem, Korth Anishinaabe, and Dunjaba, Madaw and Dodnis. I'm Peter Dinsdale, President and CEO of YMCA Canada. Certainly honored to be here today, and thank you, Jim, and the Hamilton Burlington Brantford YMCA for hosting this important conversation during YMCA Peace Week. It's an important conversation that we're going to have. We have 5 tremendous panelists, and I thought what I would do is quickly introduce them, get into the first question so we can hear from them primarily. The first speaker will be Susan Naglukark. She's an Inuk singer-songwriter and one of Canada's most unique artists and a leading voice in Canadian music. She blends Inuktitut, Indigenous and English languages with contemporary pop music arrangements to tell the stories of her fellow people, the Inuit of the Arctic Canada, and her fellow Indigenous groups. She's received 3 Juno Awards, the first ever Aboriginal Achievement Award in Arts and Entertainment, and too many honorary degrees to list here. So Susan, honored, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
The next on my list is Santi Smith. Santi is a multidisciplinary artist from the Six Nations of the Grand River. Santi is trained at Canada's National Ballet School and has completed the physical education psychology degrees from McMaster and MA in dance from York University. Santi's artistic work speaks about identity and Indigenous narratives. Santi is a sought-after creative collaborator, teacher, and speaker in the performing arts and Indigenous performance and culture, and she is the 19th Chancellor of McMaster University. Also on our panel is Eddie Robinson. Eddie was born and raised in Toronto, which is Canada's largest city, and like many Indigenous people in Toronto, grew up in poverty. And it was not until his adult years that he really began to understand the legacy of his father's experience at the Chapleau Indian Residential School. Eddie's worked and advocated for many Indigenous communities locally, provincially, and nationally for the past 25 years. He's a noted Indigenous artist, a teacher, musician, educator, facilitator, trainer, writer, consultant, and now speaker. When Eddie talks, he talks about the need to elevate our collective consciousness globally about what truthfully happened to Indigenous peoples here in Canada and all across North America. Also honored to have Serena Provost with us. She's from the Piikani First Nation, which is a part of the Blackfoot Confederacy and Treaty Number 7 in Southern Alberta. She's currently the Indigenous Manager for YMCA Calgary's Indigenous programs, as well as a current board chair for the Urban Society for Aboriginal Youth in Calgary and the Piikani Youth and Education Foundation. As an Indigenous manager for YMCA Calgary, she's currently involved in providing cultural leadership and consultation, which is guiding not only YMCA Calgary, but also YMCAs across Canada and the US through strategic work on reconciliation with an Indigenous worldview and cultural lens. And our final panelist is John Sillyboy. And John is from Millbrook First Nations in Nova Scotia and is one of the co-founders of the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance. This alliance helps to build support and awareness of Two Spirits in Mi'kma'ki and in Canada. He's also a consultant, researcher, and policy analyst for his own company and works in social and cultural development and health for education policy research for Atlantic Indigenous communities, especially for the Two Spirits and Indigenous LGBTQ. So you can see, as we indicated, we have representation from coast to coast, well, not quite the western coast, and the northern coast we have this time, and honored to have everyone come on here. So in spirit of the conversation, the first question I'll have, and Susan, I'll start with you. And I'm going to ask the same question of you all. Canada really is in this moment of reconciliation. We have a prime minister that says there's no more important relationship than the nation-to-nation relationship. We have the TRC calls to action. It seems to be in the front page every day of whether it's the Discovery or organizations doing work, but there's certainly a lot of attention right now on our issues. And I wonder though, if you can all talk about your journeys. It hasn't always been this way. It hasn't been the sympathy or awareness or even exploration of truth, whether or not we've gotten there. And as we're on this learning journey together, we'd love to hear about your journey and how you began. So Susan, can I just start with you, please?
Yeah, thank you. Sibulak pa mi koyan namik tagwanya katawun na kama imnyang na okadlang na aklunga. Amikang na aklunga tunga subtitiyut tung koyagim maklugit. Thank you for the space and the place and the safety of this place to share what we share. And I think this is a big part of the respective works we're all doing. On the road to reconciliation, we talk also about the dual path of reconciling while healing, and this is going to be and is an important part, especially. I shouldn't say it this way, but in the arts, we have had the privilege. I've had the privilege of having this platform as a singer-songwriter for the last 30 years to share truths. I've been talking and writing about suicides, food insecurity, housing crisis in 30 years when not much has changed. So when we talk about reconciliation, we have to acknowledge that the work has been going on for a very long time. Just because the language is being shared on a national scale doesn't mean the work has just begun. Artists, by virtue of the work we do, whatever the platform is, whether that's songwriting, painting, dancing, movement, drama, acting, whatever art we practice, we're also by extension advocates. We can't be Indigenous artists and not be advocating for something. And many of us work triggered. So what that means is our art comes from someplace very, very real to us, is inspired by something that brought us to the place we're respectively at and working from. So we're healing, and in the healing and in the extracting of the source and resource, which is what we turn into art, is sharing. In the sharing is the opportunity for the party receiving. Reconciling requires two parts. That other party to choose, to decide what they will do with the information. What we focus on in our work now is a very intentional step in a large, complicated process. What I learned in the early part of my career was that I myself had, for all intents and purposes, been colonized. And what that means to me is I had invested in the story I had been told all of my life by institutions. And so what I'm doing now is correcting that narrative. So when we talk about correcting the narrative, and we say we have a lot of work to do, we have both sides of the story, both sides of the table, a lot of work to do. We have to peel back layers and correct this story and correct this perspective, correct this feeling, correct this damage within ourselves first. But while we are doing this, I have the pleasure and the privilege of having this platform, as I mentioned, to share the lessons I'm learning. And while doing this, creating that safe space for other people who want to do their respective works, to do their work as well. So we're creating this safety in these places while we're learning the things we're sharing, while we're healing, which is part of reconciling, which is part of correcting the narrative. It's all connected. It's been going on for a long time. We're grateful as a nation, Indigenous, that we finally have the ear of the country. But the work continues, and what a privilege it is to be living in these times, to have again the space and place and platform to share those works as we learn them. So that's my few minutes right there.
Well, that's beautiful. Thank you. Serena, I mean, your role, it's hard to imagine that role would have been there a decade ago, maybe not even 5 years ago, just given how Canada's evolved. Maybe just talk a little bit about your journey and the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me, and YMCA of Hamilton, Brantford, and Burlington. So uki ni tanaku matsuaki, ani moto topikani. So my name is Serena Provost. I'm from the Nittany First Nation, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. And you are right. This role has been around Y Calgary since 1999, I think, or in the early 2000s. But 1999, YMCA Calgary took a venture of like a needs assessment, assessing the community about where the needs are and how they can support the Indigenous people in Calgary, the urban population. And at the time, Janice Muselberg Johnson was the staff in charge of the department at the time. And she saw that there was a need of education and recreation, that the community needed that. And, now that I think about how we've kind of grown and evolved, Susan is right. We have been reconciling for quite a while. It's really became a term in 2008 and became a term in the Canadian psyche, but something we've been doing for a really long time. Like, why Calgary hasn't reconciling since 1999. Have we been really great at it? No. Have we improved on it? Yes. So So I come from a very fortunate upbringing. I was raised in a two-parent working home, and I grew up on the reserve, went to school off. I went to school in a very racist town. You can cut the racism with a knife. And I got told that I was going to be a nobody and that I was going to have a bunch of kids living on welfare on reserve. But that fueled my fire to want to prove people wrong. And, you know, I don't know what it's like not to have a two-parent working home. I don't know what it's like not to have, you know, love and compassion. You know, I am a granddaughter of a residential school survivor. I am a daughter to day school survivors. And, you know, that trauma, that intergenerational trauma is something that I face every day. My work is very extractive. It's lived experience. And so why I do what I do is because I think of the youth that I work for, you know, trying to help them navigate two worlds with a moccasin on your left and a runner on your right, and how hard that could be even as an adult. Can't even imagine what it is as a young person living in today's, you know, just cultural climate that they're trying to navigate, with so many different external impacts that impact them. But, you know, I think we're really good at reconciling, but we're not so good at sitting in truth. And truth is where we need to really move the work forward. You have to acknowledge, and not trying to point blame or shame. You know, this is a journey, and it is a healing journey, not just for us Indigenous people, but for our allies and our accomplices, or those people that we're helping educate. It is a journey. And there is some, maybe subconsciously weren't aware of some of the harm that was inflicted on Indigenous people. You know, there's a lot of different just society norms that became a normal thing about, you know, wearing a headdress or wearing us as a costume, not realizing the impact that had on a young person. But, you know, as I work in the work that I do in a colonial construct, trying to maintain an Indigenous lens, an Indigenous worldview, honor those Indigenous voices can be sometimes hard. But I sit in my truth. I'm honest with who I am. I recognize and honor our elders and our knowledge keepers that help me do this work moving forward. It takes a community to do this work. I certainly am not doing it alone. I have allies and accomplices across Calgary that help me do this work. And I couldn't do it without them. And they are non-Indigenous, but see value in the work that we're doing and the importance of it. But I just think that it's important to know where I come from, to know where I'm going. And so I need to know where this work came from to know where it's going. And that's part of understanding that history, understanding that truth in order for us to move forward. And, you know, I have an amazing CEO that sees value in me as a staff, as a Bikanaki, as Six Gates to be. And, you know, having somebody like that behind me and supporting me and giving me a safe space to be in my truth and to hear me from her heart, not just to hear me because it's what she has to do. She intentionally hears me. And, you know, I've had a lot of people that continue to help me do this work, like Christy Rapchak, Jason Lidberg, you know, and they're also non-Indigenous, but they see value. So I think in order for this work to move forward, you have to build that nation to nation relationship as you speak of, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Indigenous. You know, that word Indigenous is inclusive. Indigenous, we're all Indigenous somewhere, whether it's to Canada or somewhere on Mother Earth, we're all Indigenous somewhere. And I find that that's how we move this work forward, is you have to look at it from a nation to nation lens. So.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sharina. That's a lot to hear what that Y is doing, and it's a great efforts underway. John, I'm going to go to you next, and I think about the journey that we've all been on, and you had this intersectionality complication as well. Of course, you know, you're a Mi'kmaq man from down east, and you're doing work on the Two Spirit Alliance, and you think about the arc of Indigenous, you know, reconciliation. I think just even all the additional challenges, you know, the two-spirited space in this as well. So I'd love to hear about your journey.
Thank you. Well, I'm Seda. Well, that's in the tail. Well, that's the Nigama. I'm Moody Jigla. Thank you, everyone. I'm John R, and I'm from not only Millbrook First Nation, but also from Eskasoni First Nation. And the biggest thing that I'd like to share is the fact that as an Indigenous Mi'kmaq Two-Spirit, queer, gay, all these identities. The core identity of my identity is being human as Ulnu. And that's how we start moving forward. And about 10 years ago, basically I was thrown into advocacy. I wasn't even freshly out of my closet, as you would say, in my community, when my friend and colleague and mentor, Duma Young, calls me and says, John, there are suicides in our community. There have been 10 in 1 year, and 4 of those were two-spirited folks that didn't really say they were two-spirited, but their families came to us and said, we don't know what's going on. We know that our community is open. We know that these folks are well supported by family and community, but there's still something going on. What is going on with our community who doesn't want to live? And so we had to try to understand what happened to those 4 individuals in our community and try to look at it from a strength-based approach.
Hello.
To not
Yes.
explore people's triggering stories, not explore people's suicide ideation or suicide experiences, but rather their love for life and why they move forward and trying to understand where they're coming from. So we had to come together, and at the same time understanding that I'm Ulnu, Indigenous, Mi'kmaq, working in a situation where I'm also in a community, but also in a non-Indigenous community where the peer organizations around the region had two-spirited in their acronyms, but didn't know how to approach two-spirited reality or two-spirited history for that matter, or didn't even understand what is the colonial impacts on our people have been through our language, through impacts of erasure, of ceremony, and our teachings, and even words that identify who we are. As a kid, I knew what the F word meant, and I knew what queer meant. They were not good words. And so we had to understand, even the word gay was a softer word because it was a non-Mi'kmaq word, right? It was a word that we didn't identify with, but it was a softer word because it was being used out there. So we had to go back and understand through our collective, and we brought together 50 plus two-spirited folks around the region to hear their stories and to understand how they survived, why they survived, and how they moved forward. We also learned their stories about love, their stories about healing, their stories about cultural ceremony. So it was mandated to us really quickly that we had to use story, we had to use our collective knowledge and our consciousness to address healing practices. And the best way to do it was being together as a group of people who shared the same lived experiences, the same trauma, the same historical perspectives or lack of. And some of those came out organically in these sessions where we were beating, I'm carrying a medallion that was given to me by the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Two-Spirit folks for sharing knowledge. We were there making a regalia. We were doing a talent show. So all of those situations were so powerful that people drummed, sang, chanted. How do we use that and reintegrate it into a cultural setting so that people can feel safe in their home First Nation communities or Métis communities or Inuit communities? How can they feel safe also in that intersection of being outside of our Indigenous community and we move forward, for example, with the two-spirited and non-two-spirited folks? So that was the way we started looking at things and moving forward that way.
Really, really powerful, and so many challenging dynamics internally in our communities and externally. And that's amazing work you've been able to do, John. Eddie, I'm going to come to you next. And, it's interesting in your bio, your journey, you talked, about your own growing up in Toronto and then the discovery and understanding of your dad's experience in residential schools and how that informed you. And really Canada had the same kind of arc way generally is, well, they buried the history, trying to come to grips of understanding what took place. And you note that, a lot of the work you do is about elevating consciousness about truthfully what happened here. And so it's interesting how that mimics your journey. But I wonder if you can talk about your journey a little bit and the work you're doing today.
For sure. Chimiwich. Bonjour, Wayne Bonjour, Noden and Dishnakaz, Chichak Dodem, Waring Misnabi Cree and Dunjiba, Nishnabe and Indian Dal. My father's from Missinabbi Cree, but they originally come from Moose Factory. And my mother's from Garden River and Batchewana area. Before that became so fractured, it used to just be, the gathering place of Ojibwe or Anishinaabe. And so, with my father, he was, at the Chapleau Indian Residential School. And I didn't learn about that until I was like in my 30s. And I was doing a presentation on cultural competency at the Algoma District School Board. And one of our community members stood up that happened to be there and shared a story about a baby being taken to residential school by CAS. And they didn't have anything to support the baby or cribs or anything like that. So they put the baby in a chicken coop and tied the baby up by his leg for 3 days. And then after the presentation was done, and it was a very heart-wrenching story, the community members started walking towards me and was crying. And right away, I knew it was my dad. And she just hugged me and she said, "I'm so sorry, Eddie." And I didn't know how to respond. I think for like a whole year, I didn't cry. And I was doing a keynote for, I think it was in Sudbury, and for Indigenous educators. And I just mentioned my dad, and he was on my PowerPoint slide and stuff. And the first time he met his grandkids, was at actually one of my talks. I just broke down and started crying, and I couldn't contain myself. It just kind of came up. And so, when we're thinking about, truth and reconciliation, a lot of my mind was, at the residential school experience, until I just heard recently about my mother's story and the abuse that she suffered in Guli Bay Mission at the hands of the Jesuit priests that were there for decades, and the sexual abuse that went rampant through the community there. And I guess apparently they're going to be getting a settlement, but I didn't know about that. And I just recently heard about that in the past year. So a lot of these truths, are the Dubwaywen, as we say in our language, that heart language, that truth language, are just kind of coming to the surface, even for some of us that have been doing this work and have been working in this field. And, my journey specifically, I grew up in Toronto, and, I didn't know I was an Indian until somebody asked me. I think it was in senior kindergarten. And I make fun of this because it's true. Like, I remember in senior kindergarten going up to the second floor of Annette Public School, and the teacher showing me, this native artwork that was there, and there's this native artist that was there. And it was it's so clear, it's in my mind. He came walking over, and so for those of you that grew up in the 70s, like myself, he had a jean shirt that was open to his navel. He had really tight bell-bottom jeans. I think he had those leather sandals that were very flat that just had a loop over the toe. And when he came walking over, his hair was like moving in the wind. And he had all these beautiful, turquoise rings, and he's, this beautiful brown skin. And he came over, because I'm always envious of beautiful brown skin because I'm so fair. So he came over and he asked me, he goes, "What kind of Indian are you?" And I said, "I don't know, Indian." He goes, "Well, we should know what kind of Indians we are." And he started talking about the paintings, and I always remember that, and I wrote about that in my master's, and I share that story constantly, because in the midst of all this pain and intergenerational trauma, and even for myself being diagnosed with PTSD because of this intergenerational trauma, I like to smile once in a while because of the allies I've met along the way, and those people that have had tremendous impact on me, growing up in the city. What it took for that senior kindergarten teacher to recognize that I was Indigenous, and then take me up to the second floor and show me artwork. And then, this unexpected ally that I met, at grade when I was 11, was a white priest from New Brunswick, and he took us up to Dreamers Rock for a vision quest, and he showed us how to smudge, and he showed us the 4 medicines. I was nervous to be alone with him, but everything was fine. And when I did my confirmation, he asked who I wanted, my saint to be. So I said Crazy Horse. And I didn't know my identity then, right? So back then I'm like, well, now I know that the Sioux were the traditional enemies of the Anishinaabe, but that's who I wanted my saint to be. And so he said, okay. And he asked me what I wanted, and I said I want my culture. And so that's what I found, and that's what put me on a good path. Because I've been first time I was on the streets in Toronto, I was 11 years old. I stayed in Withrow Park under the bench for 3 days. First time I left home was 14, and I stayed on the streets in Sault Ste. Marie for like 7 months until I was incarcerated. But I can tell you along the way, there was allies, and it was those allies that helped me change the narrative, because I was told, I had learning disabilities, and, I had FASD, and, I was brought up in a hub of violence, some of the most racist people I know are my own family. So some of the most violent people I know are my mom's brothers. And that's what I grew up seeing, seeing people extremely violent with each other. So how do I find culture in all that? In a city, in violence, in Catholicism. And it was those lifelines, whether they're Indigenous or not, those allies that tried to create space for me to engage with my culture, to engage with my identity, to engage with my language. And, I put something in the chat there. Something that's really helped me approach truth and reconciliation is, when I read about Werner Kirkness, the 4 R's, looking at respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility, approaching everything with respect, approaching each other with respect. What is the relevance to us in our practice? I'm currently doing work with Halton as a consultant, working with all these mayors and councils, and doing work writing curriculum for Tim Hortons foundation camps. I would have never thought that I would be there, even sitting across from Morgan Freeman in an interview, being in the hood. I thought it was just going to be a hood rat, collecting my check at the end of the month, and getting wasted, and, when I met Peter, we were, doing B&Es and robbing cars. Oh, no, sorry, wrong Peter. Just kidding, Peter.
There's a non-disclosure on those years we were together, Eddie.
But it was that was the opportunity, that it was finding that belief in myself and changing the narrative, and then hoping, that we, with our stories and sharing this epistemology of story and this pedagogy of story, that we can elevate the consciousness of everyone, because there is an intersectionality of adversity with each of us that we can relate to each other. Miigwech.
Yeah, miigwech for that. That's a great, really a segment to go to our next question. But before that, I do want to bring Santi in, because, I think about your incredible bio, which I gave the extremely short version of, but just your and the role of the arts in unearthing all of this and helping us come to grips with truth. And I noticed one of the awards you won in 2020 was outstanding performance by an ensemble for the Mushhole, which of course is the residential school, and just help us come to grips with that legacy. So Santi, maybe talk a bit about your journey and the work that you're doing now.
Nyawagoa, Santi Smith, Daglanyakwa, Nyungyatska, Ingehaga Nimago Sodan, Wagenyata, Oswege, Nidogeno. Greetings, everyone. My name is Santi Daglanyakwa, which means picking up the sky, and I'm from Oswege, also known as Six Nations of the Grand River. I'm here at Six Nations right now in my home, and happy to be sharing and listening to everybody's journey. So I think that's important. As Susan said, these conversations continue as they've been have been happening previously, and now just broadening that out. And so more ears listening to our stories. So a little bit about my background. I'm a dancer since innately as a little girl. I'm lucky to come from a family, Mohawk family, that is mostly all artists. So using creativity as a way of livelihood, expressing culture, and making it relevant, so contemporary in the present creating. And I was got into classical ballet training because I broke both of my legs, and the doctor said that I needed to strengthen my legs. They were worried about my, alignment and my growth plates, and physical activity was important. So my parents enrolled me into classical ballet at a very young age. And of course, I loved it because I was doing the things that I enjoyed, listening to music and moving and being lost in a world of movement and embodied storytelling, even at the age of 3. So, and then from there, I just went on, and my teacher was really great and informed me about the National Ballet School. And I wanted to go, and I asked my parents if I could audition and I was 10 years old, and they said, no, you can't audition, because they didn't want me leaving Six Nations, their only child, and going to Toronto at the age of 10. And so they said, no, maybe next year. So next year rolled around, and I auditioned. I asked, can I audition? They said yes. So I went, and I got accepted to the summer school, and from the summer school, which is a month-long audition, you get accepted to the year, and then every year after that, you get reaccepted. So I trained at the National for 6 years. But I think the important part that I wanted to share about that, and as it relates to the work that I'm doing now about residential school, is and about identity, is when I went to the National Ballet, my father said, don't tell anybody you're Native. Don't say you're Mohawk, don't say you're from Six Nations. That became a big secret because of his experience of being in boarding school, not the Mush Hole, but another boarding school that his father, my grandfather, who went to the Mush Hole, sent him to. So there was a major distrust of institutions and education, and how being an Indigenous, a young woman in an institution away from home, that I would get unfairly treated, or racism, or abused. And so that became a big secret. And because I look the way that I do, people were like, something, what are you, like half Italian? Are you part Asian? Or like, so I could kind of like blend. And not until I became a teenager did I start to question my identity and what I wanted to do as a career, and really looking at classical ballet, and the stories that I was replicating were Euro stories, and questioning whether that was a spot for me to continue to be a swan or a princess or Romeo and Juliet. And I still loved the form, but I didn't connect to, I felt like something was missing, and that was the identity that was connecting to home. Although at home, my parents, luckily, as artists and activists, instilled in me the understanding of our culture, our stories, the creation story, all of the stories that we have, the legends, understanding of the clan system, understanding of our political history. And so they shared that truth with me all growing up. So it was this weird kind of juxtaposition, is like I couldn't tell who I was. I couldn't tell people who I was. I couldn't identify as Mohawk, but yet I had all this, they were also feeding me with the strength and the power of our culture and the symbols. And so when I came back, I decided I wasn't going to be a classical ballet dancer, and I wanted to come home, and I returned home and focused on academics. And then when I went back to Toronto, I got back into performance through meeting friends in the Toronto performing arts community, and went through theater, back into dance. And then in 2004, I completed a master's degree, in which a major project was to present a production. And I did my first major production in 2004. And 1 year later, I founded Gahawi Dance Theater, and Gahawi means to carry in Gaingeha. And for 16 years now, we've been creating works and sharing them all over the world. And back in 2004, 5, when I was starting to create, there was little to no Indigenous shows on Canadian stages that were created by Indigenous people, that had Indigenous people represented in body and their stories. So I was really excited and passionate about moving into those places to share our stories. And I am still continuing to be inspired to do that. And how it kind of segues back in the beginning, the journey in the beginning was really, I wanted to show the strength and the beauty and the power of our ways and our beliefs and how we view the world, because so much was the bombardment of negativity through media, the stereotypes, the, seeing Indigenous people as historical, as a dying culture. And so earlier on, I have to say they were very much about sharing the power of our stories, and then became more political, became about sharing women's stories. So the effects of the devastating effects and impacts of colonialism on Indigenous women, and also the Mohawk Institute Residential School. That work that I have created called the Mush Hole, which Charlene Bomberry also has contributed, Roberta Hill, all of the current survivors we have talked to and have seen the work and given us feedback and supported us along the way. My great grandmother on my dad's side went to the Mohawk Institute Residential School when she was 2. So she spent her whole life at the residential school, and we had little to no knowledge of that. We don't know her experience. We just know maybe she went there, and oh yeah, she did go there. And so it was part of me doing the work and the research for the Mush Hole. I got to get a glimpse of what her experience might have been, and then also how that trickled, some of her experiences probably trickled through and intergenerationally through me and my parents and to myself. And I think for a lot of people in Six Nations, the Mush Hole, the Mohawk Institute, is 15 minutes away from my house, 20 minutes away from my house. And we are still finding the truths of that experience. Growing up, I knew it was like, oh, it was not a positive place, but we didn't know the total story of all the people that went there. So in that work, sharing the truth is what I'm really focused on. So that is what we're doing through my work, and then also Gahawi Dance Theater is sharing truth of that experience with audiences who are youth to family audiences. And we were on tour March 11th, 2020 with the Mush Hole, and we got shut down due to COVID, and we've been shut down since, but happy to say
The story of the pandemic, isn't it?
Yeah, the Mush Hole is getting remounted in Southern Ontario. So March and April we'll be presenting the Mush Hole again. And so that's really important and exciting to be able to share that.
So I think we're going to transition to the second question, Santi. Thanks so much. Maybe I'll start with you. And it's a bit about this balance between where we've been and kind of where we're at and going now. So I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit with your work. And it's a great spot for me to interject. And I apologize for doing so, but I got to be done by 12:55 or I'm not going to get my bonus from Jim. So I wonder for just a couple of minutes, and I'll just connect just so I make sure we're not going too long. Just think about where we're heading to from your perspective and the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. The work that I'm doing is about educating still. It's still about sending out the truth. And I think that's mostly what I've been focused on, because there are still truths to be told. As Eddie said, we're just learning about these experiences, and we're, the Mohawk Institute and Woodlands are right now searching for graves. That's going to be something that's going to impact the community, that's impacted us all since the summer nationally. And so I feel like now is the time to continue sharing the truth, and a part of that is just creating more opportunities to, and through the arts, as Susan mentioned, be able to connect minds and hearts. So a lot of the times when you're thinking, or students or people are learning about residential school through a book, or they somehow disconnected with their body. So a lot of song dance theater is about connecting and unifying the mind and the heart. And so I feel like that work is really important for people to have a visceral response, an embodied response to knowing that truth. And so that's the power of performance and the power to be able to transform. So I think I'm embracing this transformational time, as always, in the state of becoming.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to jump around now. Susan, it's hard not to think of you, of course, with our conversation and what comes next, and maybe just talk a bit about your thoughts here.
Sure. I think we probably have just one question left. So I really want to make a comment about the dual paths that many of us are walking. And I made a note here about a lot of us recovering from pursuing our dreams. So we talk about intergenerational trauma and how correcting the narrative, it has to be a critical part of the reconciliation process, and how we have been doing this work for a long time. And a lot of us, and I can totally relate to Eric's comment about loving the life we're in. And it never occurred to me that I'm an Inuk, because I only knew myself as an Inuk growing up. And then somebody asks you about it, and you go, well, it's just who I am. It's just what I was. Even though that upbringing and that growing up was completely surrounded by trauma. And that was our normal. And so we're recovering from all these things and realizing that for a couple of generations, we're going to be creating these safe places where our children don't have to recover from that kind of an upbringing or a childhood or memories, where they shouldn't recover from pursuing dreams. We talk about pursuing dreams and how fortunate we feel that we've landed in the careers that we have, and yet we're recovering from it because we're almost always emotionally tired, because part of our creating is triggered. And so it's an exciting time. It's a complicated time. The Arctic Rose Foundation uses expressive arts as a way to come back to ourselves gently, in a good way. So I say we because my husband is very involved in the work that I do. We work together. So yeah, it's exciting times. It's exhausting times, but we're seeing some incredible work being done now. And the foundation for a lot of this was laid over the last 30, 40 years. So we can't take the credit, but we can take the credit. But exciting and grateful to have been a part of this conversation.
Well, I'm going to fanboy just a little bit, because growing up, when Oceania We Are All a Family came out, we were so proud to have an Indigenous person in the airwaves and just representing us. Even though we were different nations, there was so much common parallel that meant so. You probably hear that all the time, I'm sure, but it meant so much to us. So Eddie, I mean, some of this is also talking about the Two Road conversation, and I mean, you undersell yourself in the work that you've done, and you're a cultural leader now in the community as well, and you came from not understanding to leading. Maybe just talk a little bit about where you see yourselves going and growing upon the platform that you have today.
Yeah, I mean, when you were reading my bio, I'm like, wow, I've done a lot of stuff. It really speaks to being in the nonprofit sector. We'll contract this year, next contract, bouncing around. Fiscal year for us, I guess, is our new year, new money. Anyway, no, I mean, the work I'm doing right now with, like, for instance, the region of Halton, and working with the municipalities is really about relationship. And it's about them understanding relationship. And for them, I'm starting them off with, just very basic cultural competency kind of training and learning terminology in terms of reference. Indigenous is the collective noun of the day, but ultimately the most, politically correct is in our language. Each of us have our own ways of identifying who we are. And if we can get people to that point, saying who we are in our language would be, a great, success. But also, being allies to each other and unpacking. This is a great thing I've heard in so many spaces around anti-oppression, is unpacking our own colonialism, unpacking our own privilege, unpacking our own whiteness, in terms of that academic sense. What are some of those things that we perpetuate, in terms of homophobia, in terms of patriarch, in terms of, this these kinds of things that we see within our own culture. So we have to really kind of look introspectively at ourselves to really see our own truths, as well as be, if we're going to be helpful to each other. And I think we can do this together. And it's about relationship. And all this work I'm doing with my heart, and just being real with people, and just really telling them, if I can help them along the way, rather than forgive my language, but rather than give them shit, and sometimes when that happens, they get their backs up, and the emotional intelligence, your amygdala gets fired off, and you can't calm down for 45 minutes. So they stop listening to you after an hour, right? So
Yeah.
it's really about relationship and allyship, and we can do that all with each other. And the more I travel around the world, the more I understand myself.
Leda, you have a beautiful spirit. There's no denying that, and you bring people in with your conversations. And we need ambassadors like everyone on this call. We need ambassadors like you all to bring folks in a non-threatening way, so we can have these conversations in a good way. And John, maybe to you, because it is about identity and how we describe and understand ourselves, and the work you're doing to I think normalize isn't the right word, but bring back the traditional concepts of Two-Spirit in our communities and what that meant.
Yes, and feeding off what the colleagues are saying, I'm currently writing a chapter called "Always Forward, Never Straight," and it's having that chat within our own culture and language and perspectives and worldview. Identity, as we've learned in our culture and worldview, and using our language, is something always in flux and always growing and evolving. And that identity's got a central anchor, but always in growth and moving forward. And it's not a linear process, it's always circular. And so that's where that process comes from, always forward, never straight. And I joke around with a friend of mine who I drive around with, and I say, "Where am I going?" He says, "Go straight." I said, "How can I go straight when I'm talking about going forward, never straight?" I'm a Two-Spirit person. I can't go straight. So we joke around with that idea, which is why and how we look at our perspectives always being in kinship, always in that collective mode, always in a circular way, always moving forward, but always making sure that we bring people with us in that process. That centering and recentering of our identity in our ceremonies is part of that process. And we have to make sure that we have that sense of resurgence, not only because of Truth and Reconciliation. Sorry, there was an emergency.
That came up with me too. That's just fine. Yeah.
and then also making sure that we have our resurgence within the Truth and Reconciliation framework. But before that TRC came to light, because this is really for the rest of Canada, we also had to really deal with what is resurgence within our own cultural right and our ceremonies and our languages and our spaces within our own communities. And that's part of the process of reconciliation for us Two-Spirit folks as well. So it's a long road, but with many people on it, it helps us with that, what Eddie said, allyship, what Susan said, the two-row going forward. And we look at it from eduoptimum, which is the word that we use for two-eyed seeing, that we have our Indigenous ways of looking at everything through those strengths, but we also can use the non-Indigenous worldview and bring it together in what we use at Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance is the treaty and the kinship and friendship and peace to move forward. So we have no choice but to always move forward, but never in a straight line.
I'm going to remember that beautiful teaching. All right, Serena, what a great way to end is with you. And, you're a leader in your community, you're a leader in our wide movement. And let's just, in just in a couple of minutes, we're right up against the end of time. But just your perspective on what's coming next.
So I think, as we, I was really sitting here thinking about the one thing that I really resonate with me is that we as Indigenous people don't have the fortunate opportunity to, at 5 o'clock, check out, we're not Indigenous anymore. This is who we are 24/7. So this work is very extractive. It's very lived experience. Sometimes we are almost re-traumatizing ourselves in this work. But I think it's really important to create a safe space, not just for us Indigenous people, but for our allies and accomplices. And I use the word accomplice because there's a lot of people that are willing to, do the work, do that hard work with us. not just be a cheerleader, because an ally is more a cheerleader that's like, I will go share this information with you. But some people are willing to be that accomplice, that are willing to, be on the front lines with you and do this hard work and have those hard conversations. And I look at some of the people within Y Calgary that are my accomplices, that are pushing this work forward, whether we're facilitating a blanket exercise, we're decolonizing our way of thinking and doing, we're looking at things through an oral perspective. We rely on our elders and our knowledge keepers to help guide this work forward, because at the end of the day, it's not about me. It's about the generation that is coming up and our young people that we are working with and teaching, that we can build a future that they don't have to deal with some of the stuff that we have to deal with at current times. And so every time I wake up, sometimes it is hard to wake up and walk out my door and be like, okay, I have to be Indigenous in a Western world. How do I navigate this? And I do it with a moccasin on my left because that is connected to who I am. Identity is so key. Understanding where you come from and where you move forward is so, so important. And I think we also have to understand and recognize, take away the tokenism, take away those check boxes, and do things from the heart. Do things because it's just the right thing to do. When you do a land acknowledgement, acknowledge where you come from first, and then acknowledging the space that you work, live, and play on. Those are just simple ways. And, when you're looking at like things like Orange Shirt Day or Indigenous Peoples Day or Rock Your Mocks, whatever those days are, that's who we are every day. We live in Orange Shirt Day every day. We live as an Indigenous person every day. And so honoring that and finding a balance, but also understanding that nation-nation relationship doesn't just apply at a political level. It is something you could do in your personal spaces and your personal workspaces. And it's something that, if you ask me about Y Calgary, I'm not really good at, giving myself any kind of credit, but I am incredibly proud of the work that I have led and continue to lead moving forward. And I think I've done an amazing job, and I'm really looking forward to where we go from here. I'm not just doing this at Y Calgary, I'm helping Y Canada, and I'm also now helping Y USA. And so I think that just goes to show that sometimes, it's that decolonized way of thinking that helps move this work forward.
Well, miigwech for the work you're doing, and everyone you're helping, Hamilton, Burlington, Brantford, you're helping people all across Canada. You're all our teachers today. So on the bottom of my heart, miigwech, thank you so much. Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. And just in closing, a very sincere thank you to our diverse panelists who joined us today. It has been amazing. I've heard the theme of Speak the Truth, and we entitled this The Journey of Healing. And if I can just close on a very personal note.
Jim froze on his personal note.
Peter mentioned that I will be retiring after 41 years, and my internet is now unstable. Sorry, I'll turn off my cameras. My internet is unstable, but to the elected band council, Six Nations elected band council, thank you. In my 41 years with the YMCA, the absolute highlight has been working with you in partnership. And for anybody who has not had an opportunity to visit or tour the Mush Hole, either in person or online, it is a must do. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My apologies to close this with a poor internet connection, but thank you.
Miigwech, everyone. Go Ahmed.
No, I thank you.